This video is intended to show EnRoute support for cutting tools that are oriented other than vertically in the Z-axis. So we do have limited support for aggregate heads, and I'll show you how. So typically when I create a toolpath, I'm just going to create a rectangle here and add a let's add an end mill to it with a depth. Okay, so that's a typical orientation for the toolpaths, which you can see are vertical in the Z-axis, or the cutting tool would be vertical in the Z-axis. So the most common orientation. But let's say I want to rotate that toolpath so that it cuts sort of going along the x-axis. So now the tool would cut along the x-axis. And if I position it, say, down into the plate, and in this case you can see that the start point is kind of in the bottom corner of the part. So when it comes time to cut this out, EnRoute's going to examine the orientation of the toolpaths, and if it sees toolpaths that are oriented other than in the XY plane, it's going to ask you some questions about the head that you might be using to cut that. So now I'm gonna output this. I'm gonna tell it a file name. So when it goes to output, it sees that I have a toolpath that's oriented differently, so it automatically brings up this dialog for aggregate tool parameters. In this case, I've got a right angle tool, meaning that it's oriented along the either the X or the Y axis, perpendicular to the Z axis. And so now what I want to do is I want to give it a heading that is consistent with the tool that I would use to cut it. So since it's along the x-axis, that's the 0 angle. So I'm going to give it a 0 angle, and it is 90 degrees. The attitude is 90 degrees to the z-axis. So that puts it along the x-axis. So that's correct. So now when I go to output it, it produces the output file just like it typically would. Now I'm going to bring up the backplot program so we can look at that output file. So I'll open it up. Okay, so here what you're seeing is the tool moving into position and then dropping into the part. In this case, it's moving along the x-axis, just like it would move down into the part along the z-axis if it was oriented the way it typically is. So now if I hit Control-Alt-P, so now it brings up a perspective view, so you can see the tool moves over into position, down to the plunge position. It plunges into the material, cuts, and then pulls out and goes home. So that's how that output is modified in order to accommodate the different orientation of the part. So now let's say I want to rotate this to a different orientation. So I'm going to select this, and then I'm going to rotate. I'll rotate it 90 degrees that way. So now the tool would be moving in and out this way in order to cut into my part. And of course, if I was really doing this, the positioning of my toolpath becomes real important, because I have to position it relative to my part, relative to the piece that I would actually be cutting. In this case, I don't know where that is, so I'm not paying too much attention to that. So if you look at this in the perspective view, you can see how that part is oriented. So now when I go to output, the same thing's going to happen. It's going to see that I have a toolpath that is oriented different than in the XY plane. So it brings up the aggregate head parameters and gives me the opportunity to change the parameters. In this case, I want to go 90 degrees, so it's 90 degrees rotated from the 0 direction, which is along the x-axis. So 90 degrees, everything else stays the same. In this case, the vertical offset and the horizontal offset, that's if there is an offset from the 0 position, from the homed position of the tool relative to the aggregate head. So if there is a Z offset and a horizontal offset from the tip along the axis of the tip of the tool, then I would put values in here. So that's something that's going to be machine specific based on the orientation of the aggregate head and also based on how the machine is homed. If I wanted an angle other than perpendicular to the vertical axis, perpendicular to the z-axis, then I could specify that and put in that angle. Of course, that complicates things from an operational perspective, so you want to be real careful about how that gets defined and oriented. Typically, I think our users are going to utilize a right angle or an aggregate head that is perpendicular to the vertical axis. So I click Output. I can get back into Backplot and open that file. And basically you see a similar output. What I had before, it's just a different orientation. But again, it moves over to the plunge position, drops to the plunge location, plunges into the material, and then does the cutting. So what are the limitations? There are limitations. I can only have one orientation other than the standard orientation for toolpaths in any given output file. So that's a limitation that will eventually be lifted, but is there right now. So anyway, that's the aggregate tool, the non-standard cutting capabilities of EnRoute in terms of toolpaths that are oriented other than in the XY plane.